So welcome all. We are just beginning our May version of our Val Lab Dockside Chat. I am Steve Parenti, professor at Carleton School of Management, and I guess I've gotten a new name in the Millie Val Lab universe. I'm now the Millie Godfather. That's the new name. So my Italian heritage, I'll embrace that. I'm joined, of course, by Tom Gunderson, our executive residence chair for the Medical Industry Leadership Institute, and we are thrilled to see you all here. So, as is our custom, we're going to be going 30 minutes, going on the record, talking to Kris Fortman from the Minneapolis CART Institute, and getting to the heart of the matter. As just everyone knows, we'll also go 30 minutes off the record afterwards for other questions that we didn't want to put while recorded. And then the recordings will be online as they normally are. There is a public service announcement that goes along with these things since it supports our Val Lab that happens both domestically and globally. We have still space for our global Val Lab in Cambridge, UK in July for 2 weeks, actually at the University of Cambridge, Hogwarts style, beautiful campus, etc. I'll put it in the chat for people if they're more curious about it in that program. So it's the cost is for alumni and actually anybody that went to basically a major university. We're allowing more than just students to go this time. It's a really unusual program, and we've had alum as old as, well, seasoned, as I say, 35 years out that have joined us in the past. It's been really a great experience in terms of exploring that space. For those who know, AstraZeneca is headquartered there, huge biopharma there. DNA was invented by watching the cricket afar there. At least they did the final mapping, if you will, at the Eagle Pub. And this is our second year there. We hope to go back multiple times. It was introduced actually by Governor Walz on a mission that I went on, basically with UK relations back in 2021, right after COVID opened up a bit. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Tom to kick us off. Thank you all.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And Kris, thanks for joining as well. The Kris Fortman, CEO of the Minneapolis Heart Institute Foundation, there's an Allina group of hospitals with their lead hospital being Abbott Northwestern. And then on the same campus is a big building called the Holmes Heart. Now I've forgotten my own names.
The Holmes Heart Hospital. Yeah.
Heart Hospital, HHH. And then next to that is another building that houses the Minneapolis Heart Institute Foundation. The foundation part kind of throws people sometimes. Could you just give us, so we're all on the same page, a background of where you are, what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. Well, hi, everyone. It's nice to see you. And I just have to do a little shout out to Susan and Julie, like my old Medtronic folks, which is kind of fun. You can keep me honest, right? So the Minneapolis Heart Institute Foundation is an independent nonprofit, a 501c3. We are on the Abbott Northwestern campus in the Phillips neighborhood. But this little parcel of land is not owned by Allina. It is a little independently owned piece of property that years ago the physicians purchased, realized they were not in the business of being landlords, sold it, and built up the funds for the foundation. But as Tom said, you think of a foundation as maybe a hospital foundation, you raise money, you possibly make grants, but we look and feel much more like a clinical research organization. We are the research and education arm of the practice. And so we bring in funds from having contracts with industry partners for our sponsored clinical trials. And we bring in some funds from grants and then philanthropic dollars, very often from grateful patients, which really gives us some freedom and agility in how we apply those funds to our work.
Thanks. So maybe give us some numbers. A nonprofit CRO is unique. What What do you guys do?
Okay, so we have about 100 employees. I would say 2/3 are in the research arm. The others are the typical HR, finance, marketing, areas like that. Development, very important. I don't want to leave that out. And overall, we're a $60 million organization with about a $20 million operating budget annually. Our number one cost, not surprisingly, are our employees. It's feet on the ground. We're a place-based organization. The majority of people are here 5 days a week. Most at a minimum are 3 days a week. But we have a lot of clinical nurse managers, data analysts, senior scientists, biostatisticians. Probably one of the lovely pieces of who we are in the last 7 years is we have a robust international scholars program. So we have foreign trained MDs who come and stay with us for 2 to 4 years to work alongside one of our very well-known physicians in a specialty area such as valve or imaging, and then they really help move the research forward. They don't do clinical time at all. It's entirely focused on moving research forward.
So speaking of the research, I know recently, just as an aside, I was recently elected chairman of the board of the Minneapolis Heart Institute Foundation. Hence, that's why I know Kris. The number, you do clinical trials for Abbott, you do clinical trials for Medtronic, for Edwards, many smaller firms as well.
Yeah.
How many of those trials are you doing at any one time?
Yeah, so we have 200 studies going on at any one time. About half of those, around 110, are industry-sponsored clinical trials, and that includes over 2,000 patients involved in those trials, which results in over 3,000 plus individual clinic visits with those patients. So it's very busy.
Very busy. So, thanks for the background. Thanks for the numbers. Maybe we can get into a little bit about management and more Carlson-like things, and that would be you've been CEO now for over 8 years. The Minneapolis Heart Institute Foundation has been around for 40 plus years. Over that time, they've had 7 CEOs, so that's not too bad. But just preceding you, they'd had 5 of those 6 CEOs in the previous 2 years. So things were churning pretty hard there. And then you came in and you've been CEO now, like I said, for over 8 years. In those early stages, when you came in with, one could say, some disruption in the operations, having been present at Minneapolis Heart Institute Foundation for a couple of years, what did you do? How did you go about assessing going from Medtronic to this situation?
Yeah, so the good news is in that whole kind of interview process, thank you, Tom, and to Dr. Bill Katsianis and others, they were pretty honest with me that things were a bit broken and we needed to level up and do an assessment and figure out our model going forward. So I knew what I was getting myself into. So that was a good thing. And I will say, and I give Medtronic so much credit for the 10 years that I was there. The one thing they do is they really train their managers and directors, and you have great exposure and growth. And you learn from each CEO that was there or the president of the business you're in on kind of what works in that environment. So I was fortunate to, take in the things that I saw working or I appreciated and leave out the things that didn't seem to add value. And that might start with the big B of bureaucracy that slows everything down. And that was one of the benefits of being in this smaller organization, is that we could make the change somewhat swiftly. And not surprising, I spent a lot of time listening. I met with, the last 2 previous CEOs - presidents, actually the last 3, just to listen and hear spent a lot of time listening to the physicians and meeting with the staff. And I knew that the first thing that I had to do was focus on the culture. You always want to stay out of jail. So the second thing was really regulatory and building out up that capacity. But MHIF was still kind of almost in its founding state of mind as, hey, we're a small organic organization and we kind of just follow the physicians' leads. And the physicians are great. They're phenomenal physicians. They are not good business people, and they don't really look at a portfolio of work strategically. It's more of what they can do. So I took a lot of the discipline of Medtronic of quarterly business reviews, annual employee engagement surveys, and really worked hard on, and Tom knows this, building the right executive leadership team, getting the right people on the bus who are much smarter than I am in the areas of clinical research, HR, development, regulatory, and that model wasn't really in place fully when I joined. So.
Got it. Thanks. Steve, you have any questions?
Yeah, so I really appreciate this, what you're sharing, Kris, in terms of just the change management. To Tom's point, that really does get to sort of the heart of some of the, what a business school would nearly come in to do. I mean, I guess one question, I have two questions, take them in whatever order you want. The one I have is, did you know what you were getting into from the start? In other words, did you, sometimes when you're being hired for one of these roles, it's, you're interviewed, and you, particularly for a senior position, someone gives you some lay of the land, and kind of with an expectation that there's change management. Did you know what lay ahead, given all the, I guess with some of the turmoil, the lay ahead, but how, when someone takes something like that on, and I won't use different adjectives, I can think of it for it, but what came to mind, and what were your priors?
Yeah, well, I mentioned that I did know that work was needed, and I probably did not know how much work was needed. And I will say I was spoiled because I officed out of what was then world headquarters in Fridley, right? It's a really beautiful, really safe environment there. And this is very different, squarely in the Phillips neighborhood, a really old building. I think it had the same paint from 42 years ago in the colors of, pea green and mustard yellow, and low ceilings and dead mice and sewer flies. Okay, just thought I'd go there for a minute. And I'm like, oh, okay, so we need to turn around the culture, turn around the business, and do it in a place that doesn't feel innovative, even though everything they put out is innovative, right? So it had this really kind of rub on that. And so one of the things that, in addition to working on the culture, putting in more discipline around the business, we also did a capital improvement project, because you really needed to feel and that you could move forward in, as Dr. Bob Van Tassel always says to the folks in the practice and the people in the foundation, is you can't think big enough. Well, when you can't find a window or you're hitting your head on the ceiling, it feels frustrating. So it's really been a good alignment. And I love now that I have employees who don't understand or know what it was like. And I love that.
So you had a mantra coming in: no mice or bust,
Yeah.
basically. And then the other question that sort of fascinates me, I think Tom sort of touched on it, but I'm just curious to just expound on it a little bit more, is normally when I think of a CRO, a contract research organization, at least in my world, business world, I don't typically think of them as nonprofits. Right. I typically think of them. I mean, one of the largest ones that's in the neck of the woods, at least part of it, is Optum has like a giant, when Optum goes international, it's usually because of their CRO businesses. I mean, how unusual is that? And is it as simple as saying the comparison is just like, well, we have shareholders and versus the community as a board, or is there a lot more to it than that?
Yeah, well, I would say there's more to it. We're this unique combination of similar to the research that happens at a university, similar to the research that, Medtronic might keep internal and not use a CRO. But we have the ability, because the physicians founded this independent organization 1 year after the founding of the practice. It's just been in the blood that we will always do research. We will be independent from the health system, from the practice, so that we don't have any of that conflict occurring, and we have some agility and freedom. Now, CROs are hired to do something specific. There isn't a whole lot of, hey, let me think about that question or protocol or the scientific significance. They're given a job to do. We get the exciting ability to help co-create with our physicians, and we are very boutique, right? We are cardiovascular research. We're very good at what we do in that area. And maybe this is for the second half hour, but as somebody who worked in clinical at Medtronic, it was always a little disappointing is the better word when we would get some of the data and work back from the CRO. And that's just because they were big and broad, and we're very focused and have skin in the game.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And also, I have several questions thinking about for the off the record session too, actually. They kind of raise into that area as well. But I guess and I guess one other, so it really is just research. You're not doing any clinical care at all for the foundation? And not
No, we have,
naive.
well, so it's not clinical care. I mean, we have a lab, we have phlebotomists that work with us. Some of the research protocol calls for research only visits, which we partner with the clinical staff on that. But no, we don't care for patients outside of those research visits and procedures.
So one last question, I'll turn it to Tom. To what extent, I mean, yellow mice, teagling pain aside, I mean, to what extent is being in that location vital to the organization? In other words, could you relocate, out to the suburbs? Bloomington seems to have some space. Last I checked recently, would it be the same or really be at a disadvantage, would you say?
Well, it's already changing without us making that happen. So I will say that the physicians and Alina are committed to being in this neighborhood and have invested greatly in that. You might know that MHI, in addition to being at Abbott Northwestern and United Hospital, have 40 plus other sites across primarily Minnesota, little Wisconsin, Dakotas, Iowa. But, and that model they've had since they founded this 40 some years ago. So you will have patients being seen and they come in. Now, and I would say that's been really important. And Abbott Northwestern has been the hub of everything. And frankly, it generally continues to be. And so it is so important for us and the hospital to be here. However, now we have ambulatory surgical centers, and some of the procedures that always used to happen at Abbott, and we could be there from a research perspective, are happening in Edina at the ASC. And some of the opportunities to consent or talk to valve patients, because our lead valve physicians, such as Dr. Paul Saraja, were always at Abbott Northwestern. Now he spends half of his time at the new clinic in Eden Prairie. So we will always, similar to MHI, have our home base here. And we believe that's really important, because at the end of the day, leadership gets together here, whether it's the board of Alina that we want to stay close and connected to, the executive committee of the physicians, and just our physicians. The majority are here, but we have to figure out a different model of how our footprint is in other areas. And we're in the middle of that. And Tom's probably sick as a board member of hearing about Research 2.0, right? As we're trying to adjust to the changing landscape.
Very cool. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks. So Steve asked an interesting question that's had me thinking throughout this last few minutes, and that is, what's the difference between a for-profit and a not-for-profit CRO? And you answered and described nicely, but it also made me think of another arm of what MHIF does that you haven't talked about, that maybe you could give us a few more details. And that is, if I, as a cardiovascular company, say, hey, I want a study done, and I hire a CRO to do it, they give me the data back and I do with the data as I will, right? You, on the other hand, take those data and have a pretty successful track record of publishing the data, both from the companies and from the doctors' independent research that they might be doing. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's such an important part. And you know, I'm always channel like my Dr. Van Tassel, like thinking and priorities. And he would always remind us, you are not just a research organization, you are a research and an education organization. And we really look at that education piece in multiple ways, but I'll speak to the one that Tom brought up right now, and that's the dissemination of our research findings. And we are a very prolific group. So you have these, 130 some physicians. We probably work closely with 50 of them in the research area. And we in 2023 published 230 peer-reviewed manuscripts, most in like the top tier journals. And so we really have it down with our staff here, our scientific services staff, who really work closely with the physicians, with the scholars that I mentioned, to move that work forward. So over the last 3 years, it's close to 800 publications. And that's pretty amazing when you think of all those physicians being full-time practitioners and doing that work, in addition to conferences and the podium presence and the abstracts and so forth. So it's very busy. We just, was it last week? Yeah, last week started our student interns, for example. So another thing on the education side is that we're invested in the next generation of healthcare providers. So for the last 20 some years, we've had an intern program. We have about 225 alums, majority of whom are either practicing medicine or in medical school. But we bring in 10 to 12 students who work side by side with the physicians. And although different from our foreign trained MDs, they are also engines to move our physician initiated research forward. And so they usually leave here being a co-author on a manuscript and possibly presenting a poster at, a national conference. So another creative way to embrace the education side, disseminate our findings, and move research forward. And we do community education and, physician or professional CME education. The foundation runs the grand rounds for the cardiology group every Monday morning, although we're on summer break right now. It goes like with Memorial Day and Labor Day, so we have a little break. But that's 7 a.m. every Monday morning. And we really have a lot of individuals, over 100 usually participate day of, but then we have large YouTube viewings afterwards as well. So that's on the professional side. On the community side, we do something lately, this was kind of post-pandemic, called On the Pulse, where it's just 30 minutes where you can learn about the weight loss drugs, or is a cold plunge good for you? Tell me about heart health and pregnancy, or what about what's new in valve replacement? I hear I don't have to have my chest opened up anymore. Whatever the topic is that's more appropriate for an informed lay audience, that all comes out of the foundation.
Got it. Thanks. I think I'll finish up here and then we'll go into the non-recorded part. But could you talk a little bit? Steve asked about geography and could you do it here? You mentioned you're in the Phillips neighborhood. If I go back to the idea of, more the Carlson view of things from a business standpoint, managing through a crisis like the George Floyd murder and all that happened afterwards, right in your neighborhood. I mean, you guys are like at 28th and Chicago. So you had both the Heart Hospital and Abbott Northwestern, but also you and your employees in a diverse neighborhood that's having an unusual high level of disruption. Talk a little bit about how you managed that, but then maybe leverage that into the leadership lessons that you learned from going through that.
Yeah. Well, I applied that really well-known approach of managing by the seat of your pants a little bit because it's like post-pandemics, social unrest, right? Near the murder of George Floyd and a diverse neighborhood. And you think of our international scholars and patients don't stop needing to be seen and studies don't stop. And so it was intense. And I think we really fell back on kind of that golden rule in my mind of communicate, communicate, communicate. And we had some systems in place that allowed us to reach all of our employees at any time of day on their cell phones and their computer. And they knew, if that came up under the whatever 88 number that they needed to look at what was happening. So we put a lot of pieces in place during that time that we've retained now and has served us well in communicating regularly, where it started off to be a COVID, communication. And that's all it was. You have to wear masks here and there. Oh, you don't have to wear masks. You have to be vaccinated. You don't have to be vaccinated. You can go over to the hospital. You can't go over to the hospital. That's all we were talking about. And this is what you have to do if you test positive. That was like, I hated that communication, but it was really important and it helped us manage that. Then it turned into the community communication. What is happening in the parking ramp, in the street? Where should you go? Where can't you go? And how are we working to be absolutely transparent in what is happening? So people, are coming to work with their eyes wide open and that they knew their resources. And I will say I was so pleased because I talked about that bureaucracy word that I'm always kind of happy to get away from. And Alina, not surprisingly, as a really large health system, has quite a bit of bureaucracy and isn't always easy to work with. This was a time where they let down a lot of the barriers that had been in place and really reached out their hands in allowing us to utilize their security, be included on their communication. So it was a great example of organizations in a close proximity working together for the betterment of all employees. But I'll just tell a story in that too. I mentioned our international scholars where we were housing them in Uptown. And what was happening there. And so you have someone who English is their second language. They've just moved. For many, it's their first time to the US, and outside of their window, there's fires, there's, gunshots. And it was working on communicating with them and making sure we always had somebody who spoke the same native language that we could make sure their questions were being answered. But I think, Tom, my number one thing was like breaking down barriers of if people felt like, oh, I can't talk to this person or I don't want to bother that person. We came together in a really productive way to manage that time. And sadly, since that time, we've kept in a lot of those needed security pieces that, just even like the run, hide, fight and cameras and doors that lock. And so we upped our game in that way. And I know that our employees felt cared for. We did another pulse survey right after that to see how people were doing. And that was some of our highest engagement scores. People rallied together, came around the mission, and felt proud that they showed up to do emergency clinical trials and came in to care for patients. And that's kind of the common draw that folks have.
Got it. Thanks. Well, it's exactly halfway past the hour.